Hey there, and welcome to a deep dive that promises to be, well, fascinating. We're diving headfirst into boundaries, when to say yes, how to say no, to take control of your life. This book, it's got everyone talking.
It really has. This book, it's struck a nerve, you know? It's
Yeah,
resonating because it speaks to something we all crave, that sense of well-being, but it's something we often get so wrong.
it's true. And that's what I love about these deep dives. We unpack these juicy concepts together. Like, have you ever felt like your needs are just invisible, or you're constantly saying yes when inside you're screaming no?
Absolutely. Classic signs of, boundary issues. And it's amazing how often these struggles, they stem from our childhood.
Okay, so let's get right to it. What exactly are boundaries?
Imagine your soul has a property line, right? And boundaries are how you define that line. What's your responsibility? What will you allow? And what's a definite no-go? And it's not about like walling yourself off from people. It's more about creating kind of a clear structure for healthy back and forth. You know what I mean?
So it's about knowing where you end and the other person begins.
Precisely. Taking ownership of your feelings, your choices, and of course, your own behavior, while respecting that others, they have their own property.
This book, it talks about how childhood, especially those relationships with our parents, it really sets the stage for how we set boundaries as adult. Can you unpack that a little?
Absolutely. Those early relationships, especially with our main caregivers, they really shape how we see what's acceptable, what's not. This book, it highlights this phase. It's called hatching. Happens around like 5 to 10 months old.
Hatching. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Okay, so picture this. A baby, right? They're just starting to realize, hey, I'm a separate being from mom, venturing out, testing the waters. That's them, hatching. And how parents react during this time. Super crucial.
So if a parent is like super cautious, always hovering, does that send a message about boundaries?
You got it. It can create this dynamic where the child, they learn to rely on external validation instead of developing that inner voice, that gut feeling. And this pattern, it can stick around. Around 18 months to 3 years old, kids start with the no, a huge step in, boundary development.
Ah, the terrible twos, when no becomes their favorite word. But seriously, how parents navigate this stage, it must have a huge impact, right?
Huge. It all comes down to how those no's are received. If a kid tries to express their needs and they're constantly shut down, dismissed, they might learn to just suppress their needs, always put others first.
You're saying those early interactions, they can have a ripple effect on our relationships throughout life. That's kind of alarming.
Right. And it shows why understanding boundaries is so important. It's not just about like setting limits with others, but also about recognizing and honoring our own needs, our own limits.
This makes me think of all those times I've said yes when I wanted to say no,
Yeah.
just to avoid conflict or please someone. It's like I learned that my needs were less important than everyone else's.
That's so common, especially for people who grew up in environments where boundaries, they weren't really modeled or respected. But the good news is we can learn to set healthy boundaries, even if we didn't have the best examples growing up.
That is good news. So where do we begin? If we want to start setting healthier boundaries, what are some practical first steps?
Self-awareness. Pay attention to those times when you feel resentful or drained or like you're being taken advantage of. Those are your red flags.
Okay, so tune in to those internal cues. But then what? How do we go from feeling it to actually setting those boundaries?
Yeah.
Especially if you're a natural people pleaser.
That's where no comes in. Might sound simple, but learning to say no effectively, crucial. And it's not just about saying the word, it's about communicating your limits, clearly but respectfully, whether it's turning down extra work, saying no to something unreasonable, or even setting boundaries with those negative thoughts in your own head.
So we're not just setting boundaries with other people, we're setting them with ourselves too. That's a new thought. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Totally. Think of it this way. We often treat others with more grace than we treat ourselves, right? Quick to forgive their mistakes, but hold ourselves to these crazy high standards. Internal boundaries, it's about giving ourselves the same kindness, the same respect we'd give to someone we loved.
Wow, it's true.
Yeah.
I am way too hard on myself sometimes. So how do we actually set those internal boundaries? What does that look like practically?
It's about noticing those negative thought patterns and challenging them, setting limits on the self-criticism, replacing it with self-compassion,
Yeah,
and, prioritizing those activities that nourish you, mind, body, and spirit.
I love that. It's about being your own advocate. This is giving me a lot to think about. So we're back and ready to really dig into how boundaries play out in those close relationships, with partners, with family. Those can get kind of complicated.
You're not kidding. Romantic relationships especially, they can be tricky because we naturally crave that closeness,
Yeah.
right? That intimacy. And it's easy to accidentally blur the lines.
Right. It's like that whole two become one idea. Sounds romantic, but can turn into full-on codependency if you're not careful.
Exactly. And that's where, having those clear boundaries is so key. A big one couples struggle with, emotional boundaries. One partner ends up carrying the weight of the other's feelings, always trying to fix things or tiptoeing around to avoid upsetting them. It's a lot.
Oh, tell me about it.
Sure.
Been there. You start to feel more like a therapist than a partner.
Exactly. The book really emphasizes each person is responsible for their own emotional world. It's not about being cold or uncaring, but recognizing, you can't control how someone else feels. You can offer support, of course, but ultimately their emotional well-being, that's on them.
So it's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
right? Being supportive, but not letting yourself become a crutch.
100%. Another tricky one for couples, time. Finding that sweet spot between quality time together and each person having their own thing, their own space. It's a dance, for sure.
That push and pull, the we versus the me. How much time is enough time? How much is too much?
Right. One person might be all about constant togetherness, while the other, they need their solo time, time with friends, whatever. If those needs aren't out in the open, talked about, respected, resentment builds up fast.
And I imagine physical boundaries, that's a whole other layer in romantic relationships, right?
Absolutely. Physical touch, intimacy, it's deeply personal. This book, it's very clear. Both partners have the right to set limits there, no exceptions. It's about open communication, consent, and always, always honoring each other's comfort levels.
So basically everyone needs to feel safe, respected, in control.
Exactly. And remember, boundaries, they're not set in stone. They can and should evolve as the relationship does. What works at one point might need to be revisited down the line. That open communication, so important.
Okay, let's shift gears a little. Let's talk families, because those relationships, they come with their own unique brand of boundary challenges. Am I right?
Oh, for sure. Families can be, well, they can be breeding grounds for boundary issues. Let's just say that. It all goes back to those dynamics, often with parents and siblings, that we develop early on.
The book talks about enmeshment, which honestly sounds kind of intense. What exactly is that?
So imagine a family where, the boundaries between each person are so blurry, you can barely tell where one ends and the next begins. Everyone's up in each other's business, no privacy, and people struggle to make their own decisions.
Whoa. It's like they're stuck together, can't separate themselves from the family unit. That's got to be tough.
It is, and this can create so many problems, especially for adults trying to live their own lives, but feeling this pressure, this guilt, they need to constantly take care of their parents' needs.
So how do you even start to break free from that kind of enmeshed dynamic? It sounds incredibly hard.
Yeah, it's not easy, that's for sure. But the book, it stresses the importance of what it calls healthy emotional separation from those families we grew up in. It doesn't mean cutting ties or anything drastic, but it's about learning to figure out, what are my needs, my values, and how are those different from my parents?
So it's about becoming your own person, but without losing those important family connections.
Well, you got it. Another big one in families, it's called triangulation. That's when, one person drags someone else into a conflict, usually to avoid direct communication or to get some validation.
Ooh, I know that game. Give me an example.
Okay, so picture two siblings, right? They're constantly fighting, but they do it through their mother. Instead of talking to each other directly, the mom gets stuck in the middle, passing messages back and forth. It just fuels the drama.
Oh my God, I know people who do that. It's exhausting to even witness, let alone be a part of.
Exactly. It creates so much tension, so much mistrust. The book, it really hammers home the importance of direct, honest communication. If you have a problem with someone, you talk to them, not through a third party.
Solid advice.
Mm.
But so much easier said than done for some people. Confrontation is scary, especially in families where those ingrained patterns have been there forever.
No doubt. It takes guts to break free from those unhealthy ways of communicating. But the payoff, when you establish those healthier boundaries, less drama, more honesty, and way stronger relationships, it's worth it.
This whole conversation has been eye-opening. It's wild how these boundary issues, they pop up everywhere, right? And you know what? It makes me think, If we're not careful, even work can turn into a breeding ground for boundary problems.
You are preaching to the choir. Work, it's another one of those areas where clear boundaries are so important, but they often get completely ignored.
Okay, so work. Let's be real. That's where boundaries can get seriously blurry, seriously fast.
No kidding. Unreasonable deadlines, demanding bosses, that one coworker who always wants to chat when you're swamped. It's a minefield out there.
It really is. So let's break it down. What are some big boundary issues people face at work? And how can we start, setting those limits without causing a meltdown?
Well, a big one is that pressure to say yes to everything, every request, every project, even if it means burning the midnight oil or taking on way more than you can handle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, that turns into resentment and eventually a total burnout.
Yeah.
I've been there.
It's such a common trap. The book really emphasizes setting realistic expectations for yourself and others, learning to prioritize, delegate if you can, and most importantly, communicating your limits clearly. No sugarcoating.
So getting comfy with those two powerful letters, N and O.
Exactly. Saying no without the guilt trip, without the apologies, because remember, saying no to one thing frees you up to say yes to something else. Maybe it's a project you're actually jazzed about, or maybe it's just protecting your time, your energy for yourself.
Love that reframe. It's not about being difficult. It's about setting boundaries so you can actually bring your A game. But what about those coworkers? The ones who just don't seem to get it? How do you deal with that?
The book has some really good tips on that. It's all about being direct, but, still respectful. Like, if someone's constantly interrupting you, you can just say, hey, I'm actually in the middle of something right now, but can we connect later?
Simple, to the point. Setting that boundary without, turning it into a whole thing.
Exactly. Although sometimes you gotta be a bit more assertive, especially if someone keeps pushing your limits. The book talks about documenting those interactions, if it comes to that, even taking it to a manager or HR if you need to.
So it's about advocating for yourself. Setting those boundaries firm, even if it feels a little awkward.
100%. And it all comes back to self-worth. When you value yourself, when you recognize your own worth, you're much more likely to set those healthy boundaries. You protect your time, your energy, because you know they're valuable.
That makes so much sense. It's like you're finally listening to that inner voice that's been saying, hey, slow down, set some limits. You deserve to be treated with respect.
Exactly. It's about shifting your mindset, from a place of scarcity to a place of abundance. When you truly believe you are enough, just as you are, you won't put up with being treated poorly. You won't let people walk all over you.
This has been amazing. It's really incredible how much one book, one conversation can shift your perspective.
Yeah.
So what's resonating with you most?
For me, it's that reminder that setting boundaries, it's not selfish, it's actually self-care. It's essential for our well-being. And when we take care of ourselves, we show up better for everything else, our work, our relationships, everything.
Yes. It's like we've been given permission to prioritize our own needs, and it's incredibly freeing. So listeners, we want to hear from you. What boundary are you committing to setting today? Let us know. Find us on social media. Keep the conversation going. And until next time, remember, you are worthy of love, respect, and healthy boundaries.